Hello, YouTube. This is going to be an extremely ambitious video. Easily my most ambitious video, and it's a response to theowarner's challenge to Christians, but I wanted to. I'm going to respond in sort of a vague way, and I think the video should kind of stand on its own. Theo Warner's video had to do with the ineffable. It had to do with the unimaginable aspect of religion, or religion as the unimaginable. And, I mean, it sort of had to do with that, but I'm going to respond to that part of his video, put it that way. And I'm going to do it by doing a brief explication, and tragically brief explication of the philosophy of Theodor Adorno, as outlined in his magnus opus, Negative Dialectics. This is some really involved stuff, and I apologize for the brevity with which these topics will be addressed. And in some way, this video is also an attempt to see if I can talk about topics this involved within the context of a YouTube video. It's going to be my attempt to do that. So, where to begin? First of all, we have to start with the act of conceptualization, right? In some way, when I talk about my concept of an object, it might be able to be likened to this sort of newer notion of model formation about an object, right? So I have a concept about an object, and I can only understand the object through my concept, right? And yet, as Adorno puts it, the object does not simply vanish into the concept. There's always some surplus value. My model about an object is never going to be perfect. There's some remainder, right, when I try to divide the object into my concept. That remainder Adorno refers to as the non-identical, right? It's the aspect of non-identity between my concept and the object, right? The degree of non-identity. Levinas refers to this as otherness, and I think that term, these two terms for our purposes are going to be interchangeable. So we can see that in any object in the world, actually, that I experience, there is going to be some surplus value under this analysis. There's going to be something that I don't understand, and its potentiality, in how it was formed, in how it, in its makeup, in its ontology. There's going to be some surplus value. There's going to be some aspect of non-identity. This is the core of this video, and I think it's also the core of Adorno's metaphysics and his epistemology, and to some, well, really, it's the core of his aesthetics, as well as his ethics. This all becomes very important, and it becomes a really comprehensive mechanism for dealing with philosophical questions. So this is actually Adorno's definition of dialectics as well. The acknowledgement of some aspect of non-identity, the imperfectness of our concepts to capture objects. To give a concrete sort of example, this might be one way to read Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain, right? In case you don't know, in 1917, Duchamp submitted a urinal to an art exhibition and called it The Fountain. Now, there are a number of different ways of reading this piece or what Duchamp was trying to do, and it's a really interesting work of art for this reason. There's so many different ways to interpret it. But one way of reading it, I think, and I think a fair way, would be to show this sort of limitation, that just sort of epistemological limitation that I have in understanding the objects of the world, right? I would never look at a urinal and think of it as a work of art. You know, this shows Duchamp's gesture here shows the limitation of my concepts of a urinal, of all of its potentialities. The same is true about art. It displays a certain limitation on our concepts of art and what art is and what it can do, etc., etc., etc. Now, once we recognize that we have these limitations, now this is all phenomenological. This is all from a first-person perspective, and I want to emphasize that very much. Everything that I'm going to say is phenomenological, not ontological, right? From a first-person perspective, once we recognize that these limitations exist, then we're posed with a certain problem of how to handle this surplus, which will, in some measure, always be there. Now that is all kind of technical and in some way not that interesting, but this insight becomes really important when we realize that there's an aspect of non-identity, or there's an aspect of otherness when we think of people, right? People can surprise us. People can act in ways that violate my concepts about them. And we can see here the genesis of an ethics, right? We can begin to see how it would be ethically problematic to attempt to reduce a person or a group of people to my concepts about a person or a group of people. This is what objectification really is, right? You're not respecting their agency. You're not respecting their subjectivity. You're not respecting that certain ineffable quality about another human being when you encounter one. This is what's so horrible about stereotypes, for instance. And Adorno uses all of this. He's very much, and Levinas as well, actually. Levinas was a prisoner of war by the Germans in World War II, so he's very interested in the Holocaust, and Adorno was a refugee. And Levinas is French, Adorno is German, so for him it becomes a really disturbing problem for him. How could German society be reduced to this? And he mobilizes these sort of epistemological and ethical insights into dealing with these really horrible questions. So there's an aspect of otherness to another person. Yet we do tend to do this. We do tend to stereotype, I think, without even meaning to, without even trying to, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't form models, right? That's what thinking is. It's forming models about things. It's Adorno puts it, to think is to identify. Um, so the challenge then becomes maybe even an insoluble challenge of how to stand in a certain relationship to the non-identical, um, that respects its non-identity and doesn't attempt to dominate it or attempt to reduce it to our concepts about it, right? Now, this is all well and good, but we can see that there's already sort of a theological dimension. This is all very materialist, I think, but there is a theological dimension creeping in this aspect of ineffability. So if the core of this conception of ethics, which is one that I think should be paid attention to, I think it's really important, and I always try to emphasize the phenomenological aspect of ethics and the relationship to otherness in ethics. I think that's really important. When we think of us and them, that just basic idea, in some way we're talking about otherness, right? Or this notion, the notion of foreigners, or something like that. Like this foreignness, this otherness, means that we should be very careful in how we approach talking about these things. So the theological dimension becomes really important, and in some way I think that you could look at religion as being a long, or a certain tradition of religion, I should say, rather than religion as a totality. But you could look at a certain tradition of religion as being the attempt to think about this ineffability, to think about this otherness, right? From this light, God is the most radical other that you could possibly gesture towards. It is the most extreme dimension of ineffability. So in some way, there's already something unethical about attaching words and concepts to the concept of God, right? Now, we see this very prominently in Judaism and in Islam. This is important. Also, the notion of the soul, in some way, is under this analysis would be a way of dealing with the ineffability of other people, and contemplating that ineffability and attempting to respect that ineffability. In some way, I think that this, at least for me, this tradition of religion is something that's extremely valuable. It's extremely beautiful, and I think it's the core value of religion. Actually, for me, this is the core value of religion. This is as attempts to think ineffability and to define and redefine and refine our relationship to ineffability. There's a problem, I think, though, with thinking these issues in a religious sense. And I think this is why I wouldn't consider myself religious, even though the distance between my thinking here and religious thinking, and on a sort of mystical, esoteric level, I think the distance between those two is very small. But I want to point point to the fact that I think that there's a problem with conceiving of religion at this level. And that is that when we talk about God as the ineffable, there's a danger of divorcing ineffability from my day-to-day experience, right? Under the way that I'm thinking about it, at least, ineffability is something very immediate. It's imminent in my experience of the world. It's not something sort of out there. It's something that's very, in every moment there's a dimension of ineffability. In every interaction that I have with another human being, there's some dimension of unknowability. Now, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that I'm not necessarily, is that I think that it's important to distinguish this kind of religious thinking from someone like William Lane Craig, right? In some way, William Lane Craig's conception of religion is directly antithetical to how I am thinking these ideas that could be interpreted on religious grounds. It's important to think these things in an extra religious way, because I cannot emphasize enough that if you really begin to unpack what otherness is and how we stand in relationship to it, it becomes a core ethical problem. And it's not just, I want to make a distinction here too, because I have the fear that some people are going to see this and reduce what I'm saying to the following, and that is the notion of the unknown, right? Don't reduce otherness or non-identity to the unknown. This is important too, right? Because if we get into this mindset, then we get into the notion that we have the danger into falling into the dogmatic idea that we will know this someday, right? This is an epistemological flaw and I've described it earlier as an epistemological issue, but if we really look at it, it's ontological. Or I shouldn't say ontological, it's phenomenological. It's something that is an innate feature of how we view the world, and no matter how far we refine our models about the world, we will always have some aspect of otherness. So yeah, that was really, this video might be tragic in its inability. I'm sort of groping to explicate these concepts that are very involved, but I think, or I hope, that just for the purposes of making a video about thinking ineffability from a materialist standpoint, I hope that I did a decent enough job. The link to theowarner's video, as always, will be in the comments. Please comment. If I'm unclear about anything here, I would be more than happy to engage, to try and explain further what I'm trying to get at. And for good measure, I will also post a link to Adorno's Negative Dialectics, to the text of it. it is one of the most difficult works that I've ever had to engage with. I think also perhaps one of the most rewarding works that I ever had to engage with. And yeah, also another side note, this notion of otherness, I'm always suspicious of an ethics that doesn't take account for it. It doesn't have to, not in a way of using that language. It doesn't matter if somebody uses the term otherness. It also doesn't matter if somebody uses the term non-identity or something like that. These are particular terms to particular philosophers. But I think in some way I find any ethics that doesn't take this into account to be suspect. And I did a critique of theoretical bullshit already, and his conception of ethics. I think that this video might clarify some of my further issues with it. I think it might clarify some of my further issues with Sam Harris's ethics. Just want to point to those issues. Alright, that should be all. Thank you for listening. Comment, subscribe, all that.